From Jacob to Israel, Chapter 4, Book 1. Wednesday. When I awoke, I had forgotten where I was and I was startled. I half expected to be in my own bed, hoping that last night was just a dream, but it wasn't. I didn't have any of my clothes with me, my books, anything. The first rays of sunlight were peeking through the forest next to the house. Dew droplets on the window caught on the coruscating light and reflected it onto the hard wood floor of Pastor Casey's guest room. I sat up in bed to get my boxers, and as the dew droplets began to heat up and roll down the window, the lights danced around the room like fairies. How could I possibly go to school with nothing but a pair of pea-stained boxer shorts? I heard the floor groaning in the living room. Someone was up and moving around. I was too embarrassed to get up and see who it was. I wanted to pretend like last night never happened. Suddenly there came a knock at the door. I sat frozen in bed with the sheets wrapped around my body. The knock came again, and Mrs. Casey's voice followed. "Jacob, honey, are you up yet?" I nodded softly in the direction of the door. "Jacob?" "Oh, yes, ma'am, I'm up. Peter is going to drive you to your house this morning to get some things for school. Is that okay, darling?" I wasn't too anxious to get back into my house, but I replied, "Yes, ma'am, that's fine. Anyway. Can I come in?" "Yes, ma'am." She opened the door and walked in wearing exactly what she had on the night before and carrying a long black jacket that looked like soft cotton on the inside and thick wool on the outside. "I know you don't have any clothes to put on and it is cold outside, so you better put this on. It's Peter's jacket. It will be a little long on you, but it will keep the cold off." She laid the jacket down on the bed next to me and kissed me on my forehead. I was as red as a ripe apple. "When you finish putting that on, there are some slippers of Peter's in the closet that I want you to wear. After you get dressed, come to the kitchen. I made you a special breakfast." I had never really eaten breakfast before, but I was definitely open to a change in that department. My stomach growled unexpectedly, and Mrs. Casey smiled irrepressibly and left the room. I pulled the long jacket under the sheets with me. I got it nice and warm next to my body and slipped it on while still in bed. I sat up and put my feet on the ground, and the jacket fell with me. It puddled around my feet, engulfed my arms, and swallowed my hands. I got the slippers from the closet and put them on. They were like diving flippers on me. I caught myself in the mirror next to the closet, and it looked like a huge hairy spider was devouring me. On the plus side, I was warm and cozy. I waddled my way out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and into the kitchen. Panic was asleep on the couch. Pastor Casey was sitting at the kitchen table wearing his white collar and reading a newspaper. He looked up at me when I walked in and laughed mirthfully. "It seems you might be a bit too short for us to start sharing clothes anytime soon, huh, Jacob? I never realized how tall you were until I tried on your jacket and walked in your shoes. Peter used to play basketball in high school, didn't you, dear?" Mrs. Casey chimed in. "And I was pretty darn good, too. I was always tall. When I was your age, Jacob, I was almost 6 foot. I'm only 5'7", I said, as I had a seat beside Pastor Casey at the table. "Well, if you eat all of your breakfast, you will grow up to be big and tall like my darling husband," Mrs. Casey promised. "Thank you, dear." Pastor Casey took a sip from his coffee and continued reading the paper. "I don't really eat breakfast," I said apologetically. Well, you will love this one. I made it just for you. She went over to the stove and pulled the frying pan off of the burner and grabbed a spatula. Whatever she was cooking stirred in my nose like honey biscuits and chunks of rich chocolate. She shoveled out a large pancake decorated with little black polka dots. It was so big it could barely fit on my plate. What's in this? Chocolate chips, she said, overjoyed at her delicious confection. Chocolate chip pancakes? I asked. Yes, sir. She took the frying pan back to the stove and poured in more batter from a large measuring cup and added a swollen handful of chocolate chips. And there's more where that came from. I just sat with my face hovering close to the fluffy cookie and let my nose memorize its fragrance. She sat down a hefty glass of milk beside my plate. Martha, don't spoil the boy, Pastor Casey said through the sports page. Oh, honey, I'm not. She went over to the fridge and spooned out a large helping of whipped cream and plopped it on my pancake. You know he doesn't get this kind of treatment often, and besides, I like feeling motherly. I know, dear. He neatly folded his paper and sat it down next to his plate. He looked at her with dark, sweet eyes that seemed to reach across the kitchen to hold her. Her shoulders sagged, and she returned to the stove and flipped several pieces of spitting bacon that she was preparing for Pastor Casey. They never had children of their own. I already had a swollen stomach, and I was only half done with my first pancake. Mrs. Casey brought the pastor a plate with 2 fried eggs, a stack of bacon, and sausage links, and hot grits with red-eye gravy. I studied his face as he gathered food very precisely on the end of his fork and plucked it off in small bites. Panic trotted in from the living room, and when he smelled the bacon and sausage, Pastor Casey graciously gave him half of his breakfast. Just when I couldn't eat anymore, Pastor Casey sat down his fork on the plate with a clink and made a groan as he sat back in his chair. We sat there for a while, both of us with bloated bellies. We could barely move. He got up before I did and cleaned his mouth with a napkin. Thank you, dear. I am very well helped. He rubbed his stomach as he spoke. Yes, thank you, Mrs. Casey. That was the best pancake I've ever had. Well, boys, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It makes my heart warm knowing you're both full and off to a good start. I just wish you could have eaten more than 1 pancake, Jacob. You're as tiny as a second. She was so nice. It was unbelievable to me. Oh, no, ma'am, I'm fine. I couldn't eat more if I wanted to. Well, Jacob, Pastor Casey said, are you ready to head to your house and get your things for school? I had completely forgotten about going back to my house, and when he said something about it, I felt like I was going to throw up my pancake. Jacob, are you ready? Oh, I guess so. I would go for you, but I don't know where your stuff is. I'll tell you what, though. If you go in, I'll go in with you, if that would make you feel any better. Panic looked up from his breakfast and barked. And your dog can come too. Hesitantly, I agreed, and we left just as soon as Panic was done licking down our plates. Pastor Casey let his station wagon warm up for a few minutes and opened up the back gate to let Panic crawl in amongst the stacks of Bibles and religious texts. I sat up front with the pastor, and we drove across the road and up my bumpy driveway. The closer we came to my house, the more the hair stood up on the back of my neck. My mother's car was gone, but the pickup was still there. Maybe Mr. Riley rode off in the squad car last night, I thought. I looked over at the pastor. He squeezed the wheel a little. Okay, Jacob, we're here. He got out of the car and opened my door. I looked back at Panic, and he seemed like he was content, which eased my mind a little. I stood up and took Pastor Casey's extended hand. We went up the steps to my trailer, and I got a key from under a dead potted plant that sat next to the door. I was acting without thinking. My mind was somewhere soft and safe. A swarm of birds tearing at pieces of pink cotton candy on empty fairgrounds. Seagulls guiding home shipwrecked mariners. Astronauts. My mind was everywhere but here at my house, unlocking my door, pushing it open. Then I returned to reality in a cold, sizzling flash, like a backward electrocution. Pastor Casey told me later in the car that I was humming Amazing Grace as I opened my front door, but I don't recall that. The glass pane that sat on top of the kitchen crate that acted as my mother's coffee table was broken and coated with crispy brown blood. The television was kicked in. My mother's door was only connected to the wall at the bottom hinge. All of the pictures on the wall were torn down. There was a fist hole through the small dining room area that went straight through the wall and into the living room. Everything that was once on the mantel was lying on the fireplace hearth, broken. The thing that really sent me into hysterics was this old golden clock that once sat inside of a glass globe on top of our mantel. My father gave that clock to my mother. It was destroyed. The golden orbs were detached from its base and sitting in a pile of fragile glass shards. It was crunched by a large, angry boot and twisted and warped against the pseudo-stone hearth. It had 4 spinning balls attached to its axle that spun around the base of the clock like a rotating pendulum. It would wind the balls all the way to the left, so fast that it was just a blur of gold and shiny glass. Slowly, it would stop, and then spin to the right in an opposite but equally thrilling blur of metal. When I was smaller, I would sit and watch that clock with the globe removed, and when the spinning balls would be at the height of their speed, I would extend a finger to halt them. This brought me great satisfaction as a child, being able to stop time with an outstretched finger. I was like Kronos. This clock was the timekeeper and guardian of tender golden childhood years that lasted only fleeting seconds. Pastor Casey covered his mouth. I could see his eyes swell with tears. I started sobbing. I went over to the chunked chunk of metal and picked up the 4 little globes and stuck them into the dark wool pocket of Pastor Casey's jacket. The clock died at 3 in the morning. That was the exact time my life as a child ended. I looked back at the pastor and he was examining the room sadly. "It was all junk anyway," I said. He didn't say anything to that. I walked into my unharmed bedroom and replaced my soiled boxers with clean ones. Put on a pair of stonewashed jeans that were tattered at the bottom like little blue mop heads. Slipped on a black t-shirt and a baggy dark green sweater. I grabbed my books and put the golden orbs of time in my front pocket, then headed for the front door without even a second glance over my shoulder at the battleground of my living room. I handed him his coat and slippers. "What time does your first class start?" 15 minutes ago." "Well then, we should get on the road," he said. "I'll show you how fast this old pastor can drive. I speed all the time, but I never get a ticket." He said this with a laugh and thumbed his white collar at me. We were gone from there, door locked, secrets and disastrous lives hidden behind thin particle board walls. I cheered up again when I saw that the pastor was driving 65 in a 30 zone, both hands on the wheel like a racer. He made little zooming sounds with his mouth when he accelerated and screeching sounds as he took curves. We both laughed. Panic whined. I got to school in 10 minutes. On the bus, it normally took about an hour and a half. I got out of the car, shook the pastor's hand. He recited a quick prayer for me. Psalm 91. Remember, Jacob, Christ is forgiveness for all mankind. Believe and he will protect you. If you need me, just come by my house. I'm going to be pretty busy this weekend because Mrs. Casey is going out of town this weekend for a Christian conference for women. But come. Please come by if you need me. I gave Panic a pet goodbye, and Pastor Casey told me that he was welcome to stay at the parsonage with him until I got out of school. I told him I thought that would be a really great idea, and that he really enjoyed eating candy bars. My first class was almost half over when I got there. Since it was my first time being tardy, the teacher didn't really even seem to care. It was a math class, but I seldom did any math in there. My grades were fine because I always aced the tests, but I rarely had a higher than a 0 on homework or classwork. I took the Slow Dance of the Snails out of my pocket and read it again. Today was the day. What would I say to her? Is it natural for snails to be too scared to come out of their shells? The bell rang and I treaded through the waves of pubescent teens to my next class, Latin. This class was definitely tied for favorite with Miss Bessett's advanced English class. The teacher was Mr. Durrett. We called him Captain D. He was an older man, probably about 50. He aged the way I would guess Plato and Aristotle had. His motions and attitude reflected a much younger man, but his stories and his mountains of wisdom were from an old soul. He was a man who thought that wealth was not the amount of money you had in your savings accounts, but experiences you had gathered throughout life. He was an actor, a historian, a scholar, a philosopher, but most of all, a teacher that guided me and many other stray teenage souls back onto firm ground with compassion and intellect. He didn't have a white aura, but he had a very unique one. All pastels, bleached reds, sea blues that mingled with magenta, a washed over ivy green that faded to a pale yellow around his feet. It was an aura that grew and changed from lifetime to lifetime. It made me feel comfortable and relaxed. That day, he taught us about the Viking invasion of the Holy Byzantine Empire and how the Byzantine ships destroyed the Norse invaders by spraying Greek fire all over their decks. The Vikings knew when they were defeated, so they just offered themselves to the Byzantine Empire as mercenaries for hire. The Vikings were much larger than the people that defeated them, a solid 6 foot over the mere Mediterranean 5'5". This made them prized warriors, and eventually they were promoted to the Royal Guard of the Empire. A nation that is built on the body and blood of Christ trusts its neighboring invaders enough to let them guard them while they sleep. Christians, by their nature, shouldn't have a shell. Christ should be their protection, their shell. Churches in the former Byzantine Empire still display Viking runes carved onto wooden banisters. A kind of Viking, I was here, that dates back 1,000 years. I loved history. I felt that through history, mankind could learn of its mistakes. But the past is also a vacuum, chains that bind us in dead emotions that blind us. Time is only relevant through the perspective of the relative shell that the spirit currently resides in. It is a process of growth and is of no use to beings that exist in higher states of consciousness. The timeless spirit. I never paid attention to the Latin that he taught, just his stories. If I couldn't find it in my heart to become a man like Pastor Casey, I wouldn't mind turning out like Captain D. The class expired quickly, like it always did, and I was once again in the hall, this time heading to lunch. In our circle of friends, Brandon was sitting with Kathy, and Thubton was perched up on an air conditioner unit like a gargoyle. Some of our friends were playing D&D, some were talking about music, some were feeding rolls to the seagulls, and some were throwing rolls at the preppy kids. When I walked up, Thubton got off the air conditioner and came over to me. "Hey guys." I greeted my friends. The dungeon master, Tommy, ignored me and continued to describe the red dragon that was the fighter, cleric, and wizard were about to face. But the rest of the kids just returned my hello. Thubton didn't say anything. He just looked at me and adjusted his books on his shoulder. "Hey Thub, where did you go yesterday? You missed English." "Miss Bessett made me read a story I wrote to the class." "I just felt sick, and so my dad picked me up and took me by the record store so I wouldn't be too bored when he took me home." He handed me a cassette. The Darude column. I listened to it all day yesterday. It isn't like anything I've ever heard before. They call it post-rock. Who's they? The music gurus at the music shop. I stuck it in my pocket. We sat down on the bench next to the AC unit. He placed Skittles in my hand from his hoodie pocket, one at a time, never replacing the same color, back to back. I listened to a few songs from the new tape. It was smooth and untroubled, and the exultant swells and furious depressions reminded me of the last few days. And then, all at once, it was devoid of momentum, relaxing and serene. The perfect anthem for a nihilistic American to fill the gaps in his heart with voiceless melodies. "Why do you look so tired today, Jacob?" The question caught me off guard. What? "Well, my mother and Mr. Riley got into a fight last night. He hurt her, and then he tried to hurt me, so I had to run. He almost caught me, but my dog scared him away." "He chased you? Wait, dog? You mean that dog that was with you when you got on the bus?" "Yes, the same." "But what happened to that jerk? Did your mom get him locked up? What happened?" He put his hand on mine as I rolled a red Skittle around on my palm with an outstretched index finger. For a second I recalled how I stopped time as a child. "Pastor Casey called the cops." "Pastor Casey? You mean that guy who lives across the street from you? Why did he call the police? Why didn't you or your mom?" I ate the Skittle and it tasted like my sweat. "Because he hit my mom and she fell down. He knocked her out, maybe gave her a concussion. I ran out the door and he chased after me, so I didn't have time to call the cops. I went over to Pastor Casey's house and he let me stay there. He took care of me and called the cops." But Mr. Casey is a lot smaller than Mr. Riley. How did he protect you until the cops got here?" "Mrs. Casey is bigger than both of them put together, and she has a shotgun." I half smiled. I always smiled this way when I was shamed. I felt odd juxtaposed to Thubton, who had a good family life. I felt like one of those starving children you see in Africa on TV, like people should feel sorry for me. "Oh," he smiled back. "So is he in jail now? Is your mom okay?" "I'm not sure. I haven't seen either of them." "So why did he get mad in the first place?" "He was drunk, and I think that he was having problems with his wife. And my mom got jealous over her or something. I don't know. I think she is serving him divorce papers, and he's scared about losing his planes and his business. That is the last thing on my mind right now. I just want to forget about it. Pastor Casey and I spent a lot of time talking about things, and he made me feel better. And besides, today I'm going to talk to Emily. This time I had a genuine smile on my face. I looked over to Thub, and he gave me one of those fake grins. His hand moved from mine, and he ate several Skittles at once from his pocket and looked away at the seagulls. Well, Jacob, I'm going to go listen to the D&D game. He started to get up, and I stopped him. Wait, Thub, I have to show you something. I reached into my pocket and fished out The Slow Dance of the Snails. Read this. I think it's really neat. He sat back down apprehensively. He carefully unfolded the poem and read it slowly, digesting the clauses and chewing on each letter slowly, careful not to lose its flavor. Who wrote this? Some guy who Miss Bessett used to be in love with. I like it. He must have loved her a lot. I think Thubton instantly understood every word in that poem. I think he related to its message of trust and honesty, and he felt its truth run straight to his core. I wish I could give up my shell, he said. I didn't really understand what he was saying, but I nodded anyway. Are you talking about that girl you like? You never told me about her. I've been too wrapped up in myself. Tell me about her, Thub. What? I think I lost him. He was still trapped under the gravity of the poem. Your crush? Oh, never mind. It would never work out. We sat quiet. Well, it looks like they are about to fight that dragon. He got up and went over to the dungeon master, who was busy rolling dice behind his chemistry book. I sat there alone. The poem was lying beside me on the bench. I looked at it. Someone gave me their leftover French fries. I only ate part of them. I overheard the dungeon master as the dragon took off into the air and snapped off the cleric's head and gulped it down. Natural 20. Oh shit, who's going to heal us now? One of the players said. My eyes began to water and I cried. I don't know why, and no one noticed. I looked over at Thubton. He never turned around. I raised a hand to wipe my eyes. The bell rang and it was time to go meet her. Thubton left me without saying goodbye. Something was bothering him. I walked fast through the halls. My hands were shaking and my voice was cracking as I repeated in a whisper what I was planning on saying. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of her class. I saw her walking up. I saw her walking up. I saw her walking. I saw her floating across the floor. I saw her floating on the breeze. I saw her in an empty sky walking on cotton clouds. I couldn't speak. She looked up from the ground for only a brief second, and her eyes were brown like the dark, polished wood of my bed fortress. I melted. Her book bag slipped off her shoulder. She lowered it to the floor and bent over to adjust the strap. A boy with short blonde hair and a basketball jersey walked by and slapped her ass. She yelped like a baby squirrel and punched him on the shoulder. "Trip!" she cried. He laughed and she smiled. I wanted to pull out my biggest, heaviest book and bash his head until it was nothing more than a stain on the tiled floor of my high school. But why would she do that? Why would she tolerate that? I loved her so much and she betrayed me. I felt that females were cunning, silver-tongued beasts that created only to destroy. No matter how beautiful, how caring, how smart or sweet they were. It would be a long time before I could trust one again. I retreated into my shell. I fled from her. She smiled. She fucking smiled. It felt like the entire school was staring at me. I ran down the hall. I ran down the hall and into my classroom. I ran down the hall and into my mind. I ran into the deepest, darkest fears of my life. Loneliness. Horror. But maybe it was all in my head. Maybe she didn't smile. I had a story in my book bag that I had planned on giving her. I wrote it in math class. I never finished it, and I never would.
Alrighty. Peace.